Heating Earth's protest. That's our topic for today. I want to read you a few excerpts actually from the Kore Kosmou, which is one of the oldest documents in the Hermetica. And the frame story is that Isis is teaching the great mysteries to her son and Horus, and he asks different questions throughout. And at one point, she's talking about the origin of everything, including life on Earth. And so that's where we're going to pick this up and see how it applies to us. So Isis tells her son that at one point God decided to create souls who would incarnate into some sort of material existence. And so he took these free spirits and began the process of bringing them down to Earth. Now, and I don't mean he in a gendered way. For the Hermetics, God is not gendered. So when God started this, the souls began to protest. They said, we don't want to be shut up in this prison of the flesh. We don't want to endure mortal life. And so they started to revolt. And they began using the men who currently existed on Earth, the human beings, as their own instruments for protest and rebellion. And so they started to set people on Earth against each other and to make war and to bring us into ongoing conflict. So when this happens, the elements themselves protest to God. So the idea is that what we do with each other, even nature notices. And I'm thinking of, for instance, there's a Nigerian goddess named Ele, who, if we injure one another, she sends a stomach ache to let you know that's not the way to act. And likewise for the Western Apache, there's a very old custom where, a tradition where if you hurt somebody in a particular location, a geographical location, and you want to make amends, you not only have to apologize to the person, you have to apologize to the place as well. Otherwise, it will do what used to be called shooting arrows into you. It will cause you some kind of internal distress. So there's different versions of this all over the planet. And so the Hermetic version is that the elements go to big mystery or big mind, however we want to call it, God, and each one of them stages a complaint. So that's the part I want to read you, and then what happens as a result of this. So fire goes first, and fire says, let them be taught, human beings, let them be taught to render thanks for the benefits received, that I, fire, may joyfully do service in the sacrificial rites, that they may from the altar send sweet-smelling vapors forth. For up till now I am polluted by the godless daring of these men. I am compelled to burn up flesh. They will not let me be that which I was brought forth for, but they adulterate with all indecency my undecaying state. In other words, human beings are misusing fire. When I ran men's groups for men who had been arrested and jailed or put in prison for violent crimes, there was a theme that we taught them when they came out and they did counseling with us. And the theme was hold your fire. How do you hold your fire in all the different meanings, you know? So then air steps up and says, I also am made turbid by the vapors which the bodies of the dead exhale. And I am pestilential and no longer filled with health. I gaze down on things I ought not to behold. So when you think of all the different ways we pollute the atmosphere, including, thanks to us, climate change, which out here in California is burning so much so quickly that the smoke is reaching to New York, right? And it's not just California, it's all over the place. It's Canada, it's Australia, it's all over the planet's basically on fire at this point. So you can see why the elements, so that's fire and air, would protest. So water comes next and says, "O wonderful creator of all things and nature's maker, command the river's streams forever to be pure, for that the rivers and the seas never wash the murderer's hands or receive the murdered." So we could go on about the misuse of, and pollution of water. And another thing about these protests is they're protesting what we do to each other. And then earth comes last, in the place of maximum emphasis. And the Kore Kosmou says, after came earth, in bitter grief taking up the tale. O greatly honored one, the godless rout of men dances upon my bosom. I hold in my embrace as well the nature of all things, for I not only bear them all, but I receive them all when they're killed. But now I am dishonored, for having naught to fear, they sin in everything. And from my heights down to my depths, they fall down dead, and they fall from every evil art. And soaking with the juices of their carcasses, I am all corrupt. Hence am I compelled to hold in me those of no worth. Bestow on earth some holy emanation of thyself. Make thou the earth more honored than the rest of the elements, for it is right that she should boast of gifts from thee, in that she giveth all. Earth not only is preeminent for many different reasons, including keeping everything else alive, but she herself gives birth to the elements. So at this point, about 90% of Earth has been interfered with by heavy industry. And we're not talking about things that are necessary like building houses and building cities. We're talking about habitat loss and climate change and gentrification and a number of other things that show that the financial and industrial situation on this planet, which is controlled by a very small group of people, is completely unregulated and out of control. Our own existence as a species is threatened. So going back to the Kore Kosmou, God hears all this and sends two powers to teach us to grow up. And those powers are Isis and Osiris. So for those of us who didn't grow up in Egypt, or even if we did, don't consider them literal gods, what could this have to say to us today? Isis is present in a couple of different versions. One version of it, basically speaking, is that Isis is maternal and she cares for everything and everyone. She's associated with canals and the growth of food on the earth. She's a forerunner to the Greek Demeter, and she has sisters in every pantheon. So if we think about what she brings, one of the things is the ability to care and to nurture and sustain. Now, she also shows up, as she does here, as another figure, archetypally speaking. It's almost as though the same name occurs for a deity who has different archetypal backgrounds. And this happens a lot, actually, in mythology, if it goes on for enough centuries. Like the example of Bridget in Ireland, or Breed. You know, she begins as somebody who's much more like Athena, and now afterwards translates into somebody more like quiet Hestia of the eternal flame. So sometimes the name stays the same, but the underlying presence switches. We talked about Hermes Trismegistus too, being different, more a wizard than Hermes the trickster. So Isis comes in at least two aspects: the earth goddess, the maternal goddess, the caring, the nurturing, feeding goddess, and then also the goddess of the mysteries, who's much more like what we would now call a witch or a magician or a mage. So those are the kinds of qualities that we could cultivate in ourselves. And so in stepping out on the way of Hermes Trismegistus, some of that comes to us by way of learning and practice and ritual and things like that. It's an invitation really to grow up. And that's something else that Isis does in both her forms. She helps people grow up. And Osiris too. So he goes to the underworld where he becomes one of the judges down there. And Osiris has been compared to all the things like seeds and other and bodies themselves that perish on the surface of the earth and go into it, go into Isis herself and receive resurrection. So Osiris can teach us about being seed-like, about how we have to sacrifice that which no longer serves, including immature attitudes and empowering the wrong kinds of ambitious, destructive leaders who are wreaking all this havoc on our planet. We need to let it all go, all of it, and everything that doesn't serve, so that we can be reborn into a different attitude, a more planet conscious attitude, something more mature. I'm reminded by these parts of the Kore Kosmou of a part of Jung's Red Book, which is a partial record of some of his imaginative, visionary explorations. And in one of these visions, which he, active imagination visions, which he wrote down in the earlier part of the 1900s, actually, he started around 1913. And there's a part in the Red Book where a wise magician character points out the possibility of ongoing, forthcoming ecological crisis on a planetary scale, which I think is the time that we're now living in. And it's all down in print decades and decades before any of this became urgent for people. And the same wizard figure, Philemon, also says something that directly applies to what I just read, which is that we have come into a time where the things themselves speak. So a question to leave you with, in thinking about how to be with each other in ways that are compassionate and just, in thinking about how to respect the elements in the earth that preserve and nurture us, keeping all this in mind and the necessity to let go of things that don't serve, immature attitudes and behaviors that we have to get rid of. How can we do all of that in the context of what the Hermetics called becoming a true human being, and which we might also think of in terms of growing up? How do we grow up? That's the question.